Hey guys, tonight we're flipping open the leather-bound diaries of long-departed Victorian gentlemen, quiet men in stiff collars, scribbling thoughts by gaslight with fingers stained in ink. The air smells faintly of lavender polish and chimney soot. You're sitting in an armchair that creaks when you shift, watching the fog roll past tall, narrow windows. Somewhere a clock ticks too loudly. You're about to eavesdrop on entries so ordinary, so serenely dull, you probably won't survive this without dozing off. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, if you're listening from somewhere interesting, let me know your location and the local time down in the comments. I love seeing how far this sleepy little channel reaches. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake to the sound of footsteps on cobblestones. Outside, London yawns under a heavy fog, but inside your townhouse, the day begins in quiet predictability. You light a candle, straighten your waistcoat, and reach for your small, worn diary resting on the mantel. The paper is slightly yellowed, corners curled from years of being carried in the inner pocket of your morning coat. There's a strange pleasure in beginning each day with ink. Victorian ink, by the way, was a fussy thing, made from oak galls and iron salts, with a distressing habit of turning from midnight blue to rusty black after exposure to air. You dip your nib and, inevitably, blot the edge of your first sentence with a smudge. Some entries begin with a blot and end with a sigh. Most men of your station didn't aim to write poetry. No, these notes were practical. Appointments, habits, petty grievances. Yet somehow their restraint becomes charming. Today's entry begins. Weather thick. Fog entered the pantry again. Cook displeased. And just like that, you've painted a whole world. Gray skies, unwanted humidity, and the implied disaster of damp scones. The diary entry continues. You've reminded yourself to speak to Mr. Hill about the coal order. You've listed 2 pounds of apples to be bought and a glove repair. Somewhere in the margin, you've drawn a tiny sketch of a teapot, possibly to remember which one chipped yesterday. You notice your ink has blotted again. This was common. Victorian diaries often had dark fingerprints near the margins where impatient writers closed the book too soon. Some modern historians say these marks are the closest thing we have to a 19th century fingerprint. Others argue it's simply bad penmanship and oily hands. You pause. The fog hasn't lifted. The ink hasn't dried. But there's comfort in the routine. A world so still it invites you to slow your breath and match its pace. Some gentlemen, particularly those in service or minor nobility, took pride in their penmanship. They practiced copperplate script like a religion. And they weren't above correcting their own entries either. You might cross out Tuesday and replace it with Wednesday. Not because you're unsure of the day, but because the week's monotony has begun to bleed together. Historians still argue whether these small diary errors were intentional, poetic, or the result of poor lighting. Some believe it was a subtle rebellion against the era's rigid punctuality. Others say it was just fog. You write a final note before your morning tea. Post arrived. Letter from Aunt Maud, 2 pages all about the cat again. And with that, you close the diary. You blot it once more with a scrap of blotting paper, a pink one this time, because even gentlemen like a little flair now and then. You tuck the book into your coat pocket. It's warm against your chest. As you head out to the street, the fog swallows your figure whole. No one will read this entry for 150 years. And yet it waits, quietly, in ink that has long since turned brown. You lean slightly forward in your stiff-backed dining chair, the edge of your diary resting against a linen napkin. The breakfast table before you is modest. Nothing too grand for a Tuesday. A soft-boiled egg, 1 slice of toast precisely cut, and tea that may or may not have steeped too long. You glance toward the window where the sky is still wearing its morning gray. Then you lift your pen, pause, and write. Cook offered the coachman a biscuit again. Must remind her it's Thursday. It's a small detail. Barely worth ink. But this is the charm of the Victorian gentleman's diary. It clings to minutiae the way ivy clings to iron railings. You've recorded the social ecosystem of the household in a single line, exposing the gentle chaos that occurs when hierarchy and kindness brush shoulders inappropriately. You consider adding a frown in the margin, then think better of it. Beneath this you list the day's errands. Visit to Barrows for new walking stick. Inquire about collar starch. 2 tasks. 1 footnote. Avoid Mr. Ellis if seen, he talks of nothing but drains. That last note will make you chuckle weeks later. You'll read it on a train and remember precisely how long Mr. Ellis described the blockage on High Street. Historians still debate whether these kinds of diary remarks were sincere frustrations or performative grumbles meant to signal wit. There's little evidence either way, though Mr. Ellis, poor man, appears in several diaries across town, always talking about something unpleasant. You turn the page. The ink from yesterday's entry has ghosted faintly onto today's. That's another joy of this paper, it remembers. You reread a note from last week. Left boot squeaks. May be haunted. Clearly written after the second sherry. Today's entry begins anew. You describe your short walk to the apothecary. You note the cracked stone near Mrs. Tatterley's gate. The boy on Fleet Street tried to sell me an illustrated Bible. Said it glowed. You write glowed twice just to be sure future readers understand your disbelief. Breakfast entries often mention food. Not just the taste or temperature but its behavior. One memorable diary from 1876 includes the line, "Egg too warm. Stared at me. Suspicious." Whether this was a metaphor or a digestive premonition is left unclear. But you've had mornings like that. We all have. There's a gentle clink of silver on china as you sip. One of your socks is looser than the other today. You make a note about it. Elastic weakened. Feels morally lax. And here we pause for the kind of Victorian flourish that would now be a tweet. A small moment of drama about something deeply inconsequential. Some gentlemen drew tiny illustrations in their diaries. Teacups. Umbrellas. A well-dressed squirrel once in the corner of a page. Historians still argue whether that squirrel was literal or symbolic. Perhaps the diary owner had a grudge against a neighbor and wasn't ready to write his name. You close your diary for now, smudging the last line slightly with your thumb. You'll reopen it before lunch. Probably. As the coachman crunches gravel outside, still munching the forbidden biscuit, you slip the little book back into your pocket. Inside it carries the soft weight of routine, words about toast, weather, stray dogs and offhand wonders. No one will study them in school. But perhaps someone somewhere will read them with affection. And maybe they'll ask the same question you sometimes ask yourself while staring at the rain-speckled window. Did I really need to write that the jam was too tart? The answer, of course, is always yes. Your boots squeak softly as you step out into the misty street, diary still nestled in your coat pocket. But you don't get far, your umbrella has gone missing again. You pause at the stoop, patting your coat, frowning skyward, and muttering just loud enough for the neighbor's cat to judge you. Back inside you open your diary again. Rain. Again. Umbrella likely borrowed or stolen. Possibly by Jenkins. Investigate. There's always a Jenkins. Whether he's a houseboy, a gardener, or just a figure of mild suspicion, Victorian gentlemen were never above casting dramatic aspersions over misplaced items. You underline investigate twice. It sounds more important that way. Next, you make a note that one of your cufflinks has gone rogue. Left cufflink missing. Gold with green stone. Possibly in bread basket? A reasonable place to start, considering the odd breakfast scramble earlier. These are the kinds of entries that dot Victorian diaries like soft exclamations. Lost objects, mysterious crumbs, slightly judgmental reflections on fabric choices. All gently penned in looping script that trails off like fog in the distance. Rain continues to patter against the windows. You glance at the corner of the page and see that yesterday's ink has smudged into a soft blur. likely from when you leaned too close while tying your cravat. You make a mental note to blot more carefully, then immediately forget it. Historians still argue whether such moments of forgetfulness in diaries were accidental or purposefully self-deprecating. There is even a minor debate about whether the Victorian gentleman's scattered thoughts were a stylistic affectation, a way of appearing both composed and human. What is certain is this: the weather appears in nearly every diary. You glance at today's page again. Fog. Rain. Fog again. Hat damp. Visibility, 1 lamppost. Sometimes the same sentence is written 3 days in a row, as if daring the sky to do something different. The cufflink mystery deepens when you notice a slight bulge in your coat pocket. You reach in, not the diary, not a handkerchief, but the very cufflink in question, nestled beside a peppermint. You consider writing an addendum. Cufflink recovered. No apology from Jenkins. You tap the page twice with the pen, an unconscious ritual now, and go on to describe your short walk in the drizzle. Umbrella-less, you opted for a quick loop around the square, nodding to 2 strangers and 1 duck. You're unsure whether the duck nodded back. You write, encountered duck. Mutual respect assumed. It's a ridiculous line, but you'll keep it. These are the bits that make future readers smile. You settle again by the fire, diary open across your knee. Your coat steams gently. The candle beside you flickers with the draft, and your thoughts begin to wander. You jot down another line. Boot heel uneven. Possibly symbolic. You're joking mostly. But there's something oddly comforting about treating a wobbly heel as a metaphor for the day. The pages of the diary rustle softly as you flip backward, reading a few older entries for amusement. You notice recurring characters, neighbors, vendors, the mysterious man with odd hat, who's appeared 3 times now near the post office. You're beginning to suspect he's following you, but in an admirably casual way. The pattern of your life unfolds in gentle repetition. Socks, soup, small social interactions. A list of mild grievances. A puzzle about where that letter went. A drawing of a mushroom you don't remember seeing. Sketch of fungus or small umbrella? Must verify. You smile. You may have been sleep deprived when you wrote that one. Or you were simply giving your future self something to puzzle over. That, in the end, is what most Victorian diary entries are, a breadcrumb trail for future selves. Small anchors to time. Tiny sighs pressed between pages. And so, with cufflink recovered, duck respected, and rain still persistent, you close the diary once again. A small smudge of ink from your thumb marks the corner. Perhaps tomorrow you'll investigate Jenkins properly. Or perhaps not. Back at your writing desk, with a second cup of lukewarm tea at your side, you return to your diary in the hope of solving, or at least documenting, a most pressing concern: the goose. You flip through previous entries with the practiced hand of a man frequently baffled by poultry. Yes, there it is. Tuesday. 1 goose ordered. 2 delivered. Neither accounted for. You lean back, staring at the ceiling with theatrical despair. Somewhere between the butcher's poor handwriting and Mrs. Talbot's vigorous housekeeping notes, you have acquired an extra goose. Or misplaced one. Possibly both. This has, of course, become a mystery worth preserving. You begin today's entry with dramatic flair. The goose conundrum persists. One remains in the scullery. Cook has named it Florence. Florence, you note, has taken to waddling under the kitchen table and biting ankles. She has become a fixture. This is what happens when one fails to solve a grocery error quickly in the Victorian household ecosystem. Things develop personalities. You describe the morning's attempt at order. Sent boy to market for clarification. Returned with carrots and vague shrug. You write vague shrug as if it were a legal term. Which, in this household, it might as well be. Entries like these offer insight into the peculiar rhythms of the age. While politics and empire played out in newspapers, the daily realities recorded in these diaries often revolved around food. acquiring it, preparing it, misunderstanding it, and occasionally naming it. Some men even logged entire menus for no clear reason. Breakfast, soft egg, toast, weak tea. Luncheon, cold ham, apple brandy. Supper, Florence attempted. Unsuccessful. That last note suggests Florence outwitted the cook. Historians still argue whether the food entries in Victorian diaries were intended for self-critique, household accounting, or the sheer joy of describing pudding. In any case, they now form a strangely comforting tapestry, proof that even in an age of waistcoats and empire, people still worried about soup going off. You pause to doodle a goose beside today's entry. It has a suspicious glint in its eye. You label it Florence too, just in case. Further down the page you add, possible connection between missing cufflink and goose. No evidence but instinct. A long shot admittedly. But in the world of gentlemanly logic, no theory is too far-fetched if it fills a quiet afternoon. The rest of the diary entry wanders gently. You recall a strange noise near the pantry, Florence again you suspect. You mention the sudden craving for rhubarb which you have not eaten in 8 years. You note the odd stillness of the air, and how even the ticking of the grandfather clock seems hesitant. Moments later you write, boy returned again. Now claims goose was always there. Memory unreliable. Possibly mine. At this point, the line between factual record and soft narrative begins to blur, as it so often does in diaries. The goose may have been real. Or not. Or it may have been two different geese wearing the same expression. There's a kind of peace in not knowing. You close the diary once more but leave it slightly ajar. Florence is asleep now or pretending. The boy is sweeping something suspiciously feathered near the back step. And you? You simply sit, quietly observing the mystery of Tuesday's goose. Sometimes history isn't about answers. Sometimes it's just about noticing what happened, writing it down with decent penmanship, and letting future generations puzzle over it while sipping tea. Note to self: buy more ink. And perhaps fewer geese. The day carries on, as days tend to do when one lives in a neighborhood where the loudest thing is a teacup being returned to its saucer. You decide to go out, diary in pocket, hat tilted at an angle that suggests both dignity and mild indifference. But as you descend the front steps, there it is again. The horse. Thunder. You write his name with dramatic capitals and a hesitant pause. Thunder again. Snorted at the cab door. Looked at me as if insulted. Thunder is not your horse. He belongs to Mr. Ferber 3 houses down. But he has a vendetta against you, and today he has licked your glove. You pull out the diary and document this breach of etiquette. Glove compromised. Will require boiling or burning. Victorian gentlemen took their gloves very seriously. There were rules. Gloves off for shaking hands indoors, gloves on for walking outdoors, and under no circumstances should they ever be licked by an emotionally unstable gelding. You walk briskly past Thunder, who seems pleased with himself. Inside the diary you add, Thunder's eyes reflect none of God's light. Some historians suggest these animal-related diary entries were metaphors, indirect references to social discomfort, imperial frustration, or even latent anxieties. Others simply believe Victorian animals were particularly difficult. You make your way toward the grocer. Along the path, you pass the usual characters. The girl with the daisy hat who never looks up, the man who always pretends not to be napping on the bench, and the dog that wears a bow tie on Tuesdays. You nod politely to them all. You record none of them. But you do write this. Saw a cat crossing the road with astonishing confidence. Made me feel judged. There's a beauty in writing down things that aren't necessarily important. Later in the day you might forget what the cat looked like, but the line remains. It anchors the moment. You step into the grocer's and immediately regret it. The butcher has taken over the front stall with his usual flair and a large block of something unidentifiable. He gestures toward it with pride. You pretend not to see. Instead, you buy a small loaf of bread, 2 soft pears, and a newspaper you may or may not read. You tuck the diary between the pairs for safekeeping. This, you later realize, was a mistake. Pear juice doesn't pair well with iron gall ink. Back at home, you blot the damaged corner, then jot down a note. Top of page smells faintly of pear. Unexpectedly pleasant. This might be your favorite line of the week. And then, back to Thunder. Somehow he appears again in your view, this time being led past your garden. You note. Thunder again. Wearing bell. Absolute mockery. Historians still argue whether recurring mentions of troublesome horses represented deeper frustrations, or if they were just, well, troublesome horses. Some diaries even include sketches of the animals in question, with arrows pointing to offending limbs. Yours has a small doodle now, Thunder, drawn with cartoonish rage and possibly too many teeth. As you end today's entry, the sky begins to dim, and the distant sound of a piano being played slightly off-key drifts in through the open window. You pause your pen mid-air. Then write. Something off about Chopin. Possibly the pianist. Possibly the piano. Possibly me. It's a fitting way to conclude the page. You close the diary gently. Thunder is gone. The cat is gone. The pears are softening in their bowl. But the day lives on, recorded line by line, like a novel with no plot and far too many side characters. And somewhere in the margin, beneath your sketch of Thunder's exaggerated face, you add one last note. Must find new route to avoid this horse. Or come to terms with him. Evening sets in with the usual hush, a kind of velvet quiet that blankets the room and makes every tick of the mantel clock sound philosophical. You retreat to the smoking room. Not because you particularly want a cigar, but because it's tradition. The smoking room is where thoughts linger longer than they should, and where most diary entries take on a slightly more contemplative tone, occasionally colored with false wisdom. You settle into the armchair with a groan that is more about ritual than discomfort. The chair responds with a dignified creak. You place the diary on the small side table and, before lighting anything, jot down. Settled in smoking room. Not smoking. Just thinking. Maybe illegal. You stare into the gas lamp's soft glow. In the corner, a stack of old newspapers leans slightly, threatening collapse but never committing. A portrait of someone's great-uncle stares from the wall with judgment you've long learned to ignore. Now comes the part of the day where other people's voices trickle in. From down the hallway, a low hum of conversation. The butler speaking softly. Someone rustling the cutlery drawer. Footsteps above, perhaps. It's hard to say. You scribble. Eavesdropped by accident. Heard something about the hedges. Intrigued but too tired to pursue. The smoking room is, after all, where overheard fragments become full stories by the time they hit the diary page. You once spent 3 entries speculating on whether Mrs. Pembroke had a second parrot or merely a very echoey hallway. Tonight you hear a name, possibly Alfred, and the word custard. You combine the two in your mind and decide that Alfred has made a poor dessert choice. Into the diary. Alfred's custard incident continues. May require apology or recipe revision. Historians still debate the reliability of such entries. Some believe they reflect social gossip in its most distilled form. Others argue these were fanciful embellishments written simply to amuse the author. You sip something warm, tea, brandy, it's hard to tell in this light, and gaze at the fire that isn't lit because the room's already too warm. Still you pretend there's a fire. You pretend you're dramatically pondering something. Then you write. Imaginary fireplace highly satisfying. No smoke, all symbolism. At this point, the diary begins to drift into the more abstract. Your handwriting loosens, curls more than usual, letters stretch like they're exhaling. This is the influence of the hour. The ink, perhaps. Or the chair's uncanny ability to melt one's spine into reflection. You record a small thing you noticed earlier. Chair in front room uneven. Rocked like it had opinions. It didn't, obviously. But it's nice to pretend furniture might one day rise up and challenge you to a duel. You make another note, this one less whimsical. Missed my walk today. Sky too heavy. Felt like it might drop something. That's how you describe rain now. Not as a forecast, but as a possibility, something the heavens might absent-mindedly spill. Just before you close the diary for the night, someone pokes their head into the smoking room. Sir, Jenkins found your missing cravat. It was behind the umbrella stand. You turn your head slowly. Of course it was. You right. Cravat recovered. Jenkins maintains innocence. I remain unconvinced. A soft pause. You underline the word unconvinced. The mystery lives on. You end the entry with a final line, one that might mean something or might mean nothing at all. Even the quietest rooms have conversations if you sit long enough. And then, with a stretch and a sigh and a flick of the wrist, the diary is closed. Not locked, not hidden, just closed. Like a room gently emptying itself of thought. Late afternoon settles like dust, gently and without warning. The light filtering through the windows has turned that soft, golden beige that makes everything, especially unpaid bills, look poetic. You sit once more at your desk, diary open, nib sharpened, and a quiet sense that something has been misplaced. And you're right. The cravat has returned, but something else has vanished. You flip back a few pages, eyes scanning quickly. Ah yes, your notes on the tailor's bill. Gone. Or rather, not gone, but never written. You remember thinking about it. You may have even talked to yourself about it. But somehow the actual writing never occurred. Must remember to remember, you jot. Tailor increasingly confident I will not. Victorian finances were a slow-moving disaster in polite trousers. Bills came by post, often with elegant handwriting and devastating numbers. You note. Button repair, 3 shillings. Outrageous. Button not even fond of me. This is followed by a small drawing of a very unimpressed button. Possibly sarcastic. Possibly a metaphor for how you feel about your trousers. Gentlemen often kept financial notes in diaries, not because they were precise but because they were forgetful. They preferred to scatter reminders across weeks, like breadcrumbs for a future version of themselves to follow in mild panic. You add, paid something to someone. May have been for candles. Or beans. Historians still argue whether the vagueness in such entries was due to embarrassment, laziness, or a belief that future readers would simply figure it out. Sadly, future readers, namely historians, spend entire papers not figuring it out. You flip to a blank page, irritated. You had a system once. Bills in the back. Observations in the front. Doodles down the left. But now it's chaos. The entry for Tuesday includes 3 wardrobe complaints, 1 soup description, and a mildly threatening poem about your neighbor's dog. Dog barked again. Wrote him a haiku out of spite. The haiku is scratched into the margin. It reads, small, loud, and unwise. Barks at leaves and monarchs both. Knows not what he is. You underline monarchs, just in case it's interpreted historically rather than etymologically. Then your mind drifts, because that's what minds do in the presence of soft lighting and unfinished ledgers. You think about your wardrobe again. Lost cravat recovered. Lost dignity less certain. You make a list beneath it. 1 glove brown. 2 buttons silver, likely attached to neighbor's cat. 3 receipts illegible. 4 hours missing from last Sunday. You pause at number 4. Those hours were likely spent napping, but you prefer the drama of uncertainty. Possible time warp, you write? More likely pudding induced. Financial matters drift away again. You notice the edge of the diary's cover has worn down, little phrase of leather curling like dried leaves. Makes the book feel alive. You touch the spine and write. Diary aging faster than I am. At least it remembers where I was. Some modern readers assume Victorian gentlemen were always focused on productivity, enterprise, ambition. And yes, some were. But most had days like this, half spent in rumination, wandering thoughts, and extremely detailed notes about sock elasticity. You check your pocket watch. It's still ticking. But just barely. Time moving like molasses in a cold spoon, you note. May need to wind again. Or let it stop out of spite. As evening creeps in and the shadows stretch across your desk like lazy cats, you make one last financial reflection. Paid the coal man. Probably. If not, may need to hide. And with that, the page closes not on a resolution but a soft shrug. An admission that today was not productive, but it was at least recorded. And sometimes that's enough. You're seated in the upper balcony of the opera house now, pressed into red velvet that has known better decades, the faint smell of lavender oil clinging to the curtains like gossip. The overture hasn't started yet, which gives you just enough time to discreetly remove your diary from your coat and scribble something while pretending to study the program. Lady in plum again. Same seat. Same glance. Still no words. You draw a tiny plum beside the line, not the fruit but the color, a strange blend of purple and memory. This woman has appeared in your diary before, always peripheral, always half-shadowed by propriety. You've never spoken. You've never even stood at the same moment. And yet, in this silent, ink-swept narrative of your days, she's as present as rain. You pretend to study the conductor's entrance, but really your eyes flick sideways. She fans herself twice, then stops, possibly to let you notice the fan. You don't write that part down. Too forward. Instead, fan with lace trim. Ivory. Possibly a gift. Possibly a message. Victorian gentlemen were masters of restrained obsession. One didn't declare affection. One documented it, in riddles, in metaphors, in passing mentions lodged between tea temperatures and umbrella thefts. Historians still argue whether such entries were romantic, delusional, or merely aesthetic. They often point to a famous 1873 diary that mentioned the same woman 68 times in a year without ever including her name. Scholars refer to her only as the stationary ghost. Tonight, the lady in plum does something remarkable. She smiles. Not broadly, not at you directly, but in your general direction. This is enough to trigger a 3-line poem. She smiled like dusk. Velvet without thunder. Or perhaps too much thunder. You write the poem hastily. Then cross out the last line. Still too bitter about the horse. The opera begins. You pause your scribbling, though your thoughts still dance along the margins of the performance. 10 minutes and you can't help yourself. Tenor overreaches. Sounds like someone ironing with conviction. You smile to yourself. The humor is not meant for anyone else. Your diary is your confidant, your co-conspirator. It's where you store observations too fragile or too foolish for conversation. The music swells and so does your mood. A note. Tonight's violin solo, like walking barefoot through moonlight. Uneven but luminous. The lady in plum shifts. You note that too. And the fact that she whispers something to the man beside her, though you suspect he's her brother, not a rival. You hope he's her brother. Glove adjusted twice. Nervous? Or itchy? Debate continues. That's the kind of line that will haunt you for weeks, until she reappears and does something equally mysterious, like dropping a handkerchief or glancing at your cravat. You plan to write down both when it happens. During intermission you retreat to the smoking vestibule, but you don't light anything. You open the diary again, balancing it on the edge of the marble ledge. Intermission reflections. Opera farce, audience stiff, seat softer than expected. A man near you discusses politics loudly. You pretend not to hear. But the diary does. Man behind me believes Belgium is a concept, not a country. Troubling. Later you will try to recall whether he had a mustache. You suspect he did. The bell rings and you return to your seat. The lady in plum is still there. Still not looking your way. Or maybe she is, through the corner of her vision. You resist the urge to write something sentimental. Instead you jot. Plum remains the most underestimated shade in all of London. And then, because you can't help yourself, if she vanishes next week, I'll invent her from memory. The music carries you through the rest of the night. Your final note is less poetic, more practical. Program lost beneath seat. Will retrieve later. Or not. Memory preferable. And with that, you tuck the diary away. The orchestra begins its final swell. The lady in plum doesn't vanish, but you pretend she does just to give the evening an ending. The rain has returned by morning, not as a downpour but as a sort of persistent mist that makes everything feel vaguely undecided. You stare out the parlor window with a teacup in hand, watching droplets collect on the edge of the sill, and feel compelled to check on the tulips. Your diary is already open. The ink from last night's opera entry has dried into delicate webs, and you try not to smear it as you write. Tulips again. Look suspicious. Maybe conspiring with dandelions. You've long suspected that the tulips dislike you. Not overtly, but subtly, by blooming unevenly, leaning away when you approach, or wilting slightly more on days when your cravat is crooked. Gardening, for you, is less about growth and more about a sustained battle of will and aesthetic preference. Planted 6. Only 5 agree to show up. Typical. You scribble a small sketch of the defiant tulip, labeled Henrietta, because it helps to name one's enemies. Victorian men often kept gardening notes in their diaries, not because they were botanical experts, but because plants were among the few things they were allowed to fuss over emotionally. Roses were metaphors. Weeds were personality flaws. And tulips? Well, tulips were tricky. Historians still argue whether these notes reflect genuine horticultural ambition or quiet existential panic. The famous diarist Edward Laddington once devoted 3 weeks of entries to a single daffodil, ending only when it was trampled by a neighbor's dog named Percival. The incident was recorded as tragedy in yellow. Justice remains unserved. Today, the rain has made the garden path slippery and you nearly fall, though not in a way that would concern anyone, just enough to shake the teacup and spill a drop onto your waistcoat. Naturally, this must be documented. Tea sacrificed to the soil. Nature demands offerings. You crouch near the tulips, mutter something non-committal, and return indoors before the plants can sense your insecurity. Once seated again, slightly damp and oddly victorious, you resume writing. Attempted to reason with Henrietta. She turns slightly. Defiance confirmed. You glance at yesterday's entry and realize you've mentioned tulips 7 days in a row. It may be becoming a problem. You underline Henrietta, and write a note beside it. Consider diversifying nemesis. Perhaps something edible. Indeed, the garden is not your only battleground. The rose trellis is currently collapsing in what can only be described as a graceful, poetic spiral. You suspect the ivy is involved. It always is. You add to the entry. Ivy possibly aligned with moss. No proof. Just a feeling. There's a quiet absurdity in all this. You know it. But the act of writing these tiny plant dramas into your diary gives them shape. Lets them exist somewhere beyond soggy boots and half-finished chores. It's soothing. In its own ridiculous way. You read back an old line from spring. First crocus arrived. Walked straight into the day like it owned the place. You smile. That was a good line. Possibly your best flower-related entry to date. Suddenly a thought occurs to you. What if the tulips are not the problem? What if it's the soil? Or the light? Or Jenkins again? Note, question Jenkins on his watering technique. Maybe overhydrating out of spite. You pause. A faint knock at the door. A letter is slipped under. You pick it up. It's from your cousin in Devon. She's included a pressed violet in the envelope and a note about planting something called evening primrose. You immediately respond, via diary of course. Cousin suggests new species. Violet arrived dead. Ominous. Still you draw it. A little shriveled violet in the corner of the page. You label it Felicity, for balance. As the rain continues and your teacup refills itself via silent household magic, you end the entry with one final reflection. If tulips are messengers, I wish they'd be clearer. Or just write back. You close the diary with a soft pat. The garden still looms outside. The war continues tomorrow. The hour drapes itself across the drawing room like a lazy shawl, and you find yourself once again reclining in the armchair, half thinking, half dozing, and fully committed to doing nothing of importance. It is during this precise sort of lull, this gentle dip in the day's momentum, that the concept of the polite nap arises. You open your diary and write. 3 o'clock. Weather settled. Chair comfortable. Spirit amenable to unconsciousness. The Victorian world took its naps seriously, though of course never called them naps outright. They were repose, restoration, or in extreme cases, temporary withdrawal for respiratory reflection. You scribble a note. Today's rest to be brief and noble. Legs elevated. You adjust your limbs with the precision of a man staging a portrait of relaxation. The cushion behind your back sighs in approval. One hand still holds the diary loosely, the pen resting in your fingers like a reluctant sword. Historians still argue whether Victorian diaries recorded naps because they were significant or simply because they occupied that delicious liminal space between lunch and obligation. Either way, they appear frequently, and always with a kind of poetic self-importance. Fell into a restorative slumber. Dreamt of bread. Unsure of meaning. You jot down the above quote from your own last week. It still holds up. Today you attempt to nap. You close your eyes. Breathe. Count your thoughts backward. And just as sleep begins to consider visiting you, a spoon clatters in the hallway. You remain still. Spoon disrupted initial descent. Attempt 2 initiated. There is something heroic in trying again. Victorian gentlemen were often criticized for their stillness. Too much leisure, some said. Too many naps. But really there's an art to pausing. To dozing without shame. To writing down the fact that you did it. You think back to a diary you once read, belonging to a retired barrister from Kent. He had an entire page that simply read, napped, sneezed, napped again. Felt triumphant. That man was a philosopher in disguise. Your own nap, however, is proving less cooperative. The room is too quiet in all the wrong ways. You start hearing strange things. The ticking of the clock suddenly sounds aggressive. The fireplace not lit, somehow whistles. You open your eyes. Stillness again. Ambient silence beginning to heckle me. You adjust your position. Leg over knee. Arm beneath pillow. Chin at a 45-degree angle that suggests both dignity and submission to gravity. And this time, it works. At least for a while. You drift. You don't dream exactly. But there are shapes, possibly involving a tulip duel or Thunder the horse winning an opera contest. You're not sure. You wake gently like a letter being opened. Awoke at 4. Mildly confused. Chair absorbed entire left side. You stretch. Bones creak like old floorboards. You glance around to confirm that the world still exists. It does. Jenkins is dusting something that doesn't need dusting. A faint breeze comes from nowhere in particular. You add. Woke refreshed but suspicious. Feel I missed something vital. Possibly tea. Polite naps were considered acceptable under very specific conditions. The trick was to never admit you intended to nap. You merely rested your eyes, or drifted in thought. Anything more specific would imply idleness of the moral variety. Should the Queen ask, you write, I was engaged in reflective silence. Your diary now holds 5 entries that begin with some version of, did not mean to fall asleep. Which, of course, means you absolutely meant to. Before closing the book, you scribble a final thought. Nap ended. Dignity partially intact. Next time, tighter trousers. It makes no sense, but you're too content to revise it. You place the diary back on the table with the reverence of someone finishing a novel, even though the story was mostly about your own slow collapse into a cushion. And as the kettle hisses gently from the next room, you sit still for a moment longer, wondering if you should write down the fact that Jenkins made no noise while he moved the sugar bowl. You decide against it. Some mysteries must remain. The afternoon has softened into that bluish-gray twilight that makes everything look a bit like a faded painting. You're back at your desk, the diary open before you, a fresh page waiting with quiet expectation. But tonight you hesitate. In your hand is a letter. One you wrote this morning, then folded, then unfolded, then folded again. It rests beside your diary like an awkward guest, present, undeniable, and not quite sure if it belongs. Letter unsent. Not due to cowardice. Possibly due to cowardice. The letter is addressed to no one in particular. Or perhaps to someone very particular indeed. Someone you've not written to in years or ever. A cousin. A friend. A person who once shared a rainy afternoon and a half-laughed joke. You don't sign it. You don't seal it. Instead, you slide it inside the diary between pages dated 3 weeks apart, as if hiding it there will somehow give it context. Victorian gentlemen frequently wrote letters they never intended to send. The practice, though not widely advertised, appears in many diaries. Lines like, drafted a reply to Miss H, burned before tea, or wrote to my brother, decided he wouldn't understand, threw it in the stove. Historians still argue whether these unsent letters were genuine emotional exercises, or simply the Edwardian equivalent of muttering in the bath. Regardless, they carry a certain sacred weight, confessions without consequence. You scribble beside the letter. Content sincere. Tone uncertain. Grammar impeccable. You consider reading it aloud, then decide against it. Instead, you review your day backward like rewinding a film. This morning, tea too hot. Trousers slightly too loud, that unfortunate fabric swish. Jenkins humming a tune you didn't recognize. You write. Possibly Irish. Possibly invented. Possibly a cry for help. You then return the borrowed atlas to the neighbor whose name you never remember, and who once accused your rhododendrons of being morally immodest. This deserves a mention. Return book. Was thanked without eye contact. Situation satisfactory. Midday brought a rare beam of sunlight, during which you nearly forgot to complain. You rectify this retroactively. Sun showed up uninvited. Bright. Suspiciously cheerful. Lasted 14 minutes. You glance back toward the unsent letter. It's still there, stubborn as ever. You remember something from your youth, your great-uncle's words. A letter unwritten is merely a thought in formal attire. You once thought that sounded wise. Now you're not so sure. Letter remains unsent. We'll reconsider tomorrow. Or in a decade. Victorian diaries often carried these sorts of suspended thoughts. Half decisions that never resolved and yet were dutifully recorded. The process itself was the point. You tap your pen against the page and stare into the corner of the room, where a single cobweb waves slightly in the breeze. Not dramatic enough to clean. Not poetic enough to write about. But you do anyway. Spider in corner. Undecided about architecture. Admirable restraint. The page is filling now. Your penmanship has loosened again, curving like a river unsure of its destination. You write one final reflection. Some things must be said. Others simply written, then folded, then forgotten. You close the diary gently, trapping the letter inside as though it were a secret pressed between leaves. No wax seal. No postmark. Just ink on paper and a sigh in the spine of the book. Tomorrow you might throw it away. Or you might not. Evening draws nearer, and your stomach, rather insistently, reminds you that supper has been slightly delayed. Not because of any great tragedy or obligation, but because the toast was too brown and the tea was too weak, and naturally, that required an extended period of mild disappointment. You return to your diary with a sigh, pen at the ready. Supper arrived with fanfare. Disappointment immediate. The toast, you note, has been charred at the edge and soggy at the center, which, by your measure, is a remarkable accomplishment in culinary contradiction. You pause mid-thought to scribble. Bread prepared in violation of nature's balance. The tea, meanwhile, tasted faintly of regret and overboiled leaves. You narrow your eyes as you write. Flavor somewhere between dishwater and broken promise. Victorian gentlemen, while publicly composed, were privately relentless in their diaries when it came to mealtime grievances. Entire pages were devoted to soup temperatures, pudding textures, and the recurring injustice of butter that refused to spread politely. You add, requested stronger tea. Was met with a shrug in lemon. Utter betrayal. Jenkins, of course, maintains that the tea was acceptable. You beg to differ. Historians still debate the purpose of such culinary commentary. Some propose that food was one of the few areas in which gentlemen could safely express dissatisfaction without political fallout. Others suggest it was simply something to write about when nothing else happened. Today's entry is quickly becoming a culinary review. You add another line. Biscuit stale. Possibly from Crimean era. You exaggerate. But only slightly. As you recount the meal, you pause for an oddly pleasant moment. The jam. Raspberry with a hint of vanilla. It was, to your surprise, exquisite. You write. Jam perfection achieved. Tiny miracle amidst edible confusion. You circle the line. You consider drawing a tiny jar beside it but decide against it. That would be frivolous. And tomorrow you'll probably be let down again by the marmalade. You leaf back a few pages and notice a recurring pattern. A weekly cycle of culinary highs and lows, documented with increasing theatrical flair. A week ago. Egg boiled into oblivion. Shell wept silently. And the week before. Bread soft. Butter compliant. Tea nearly meaningful. Clearly, food has become your emotional barometer. You pause, pen resting gently against your chin, and glance at the window. The garden outside is dark now, tulips presumably engaged in some sort of passive-aggressive moonlit gossip. You jot one more observation. Dinner ended with silence. Jenkins cleared plates like a ghost with opinions. You do suspect Jenkins adds a bit of extra clatter when he's unimpressed with your comments. Or your tie. Possibly both. Then, perhaps out of guilt or perhaps just balance, you return to the jam. Second spoonful of jam, bold move. Felt like triumph. You consider dedicating an entire page to jam reviews. You think better of it, but you do write. Idea. Published Journal of Preserves. The Gentleman's Guide to Breakfast Redemption. Historians centuries from now may never understand your fascination with toast quality. Or they may admire it, marveling at how even a simple diary page could capture the essence of a day with nothing more than bread, butter, and regret. As the gas lamps flicker gently in the hallway, you close today's entry with one last remark. If I perish in my sleep tonight, let the record show, the tea did not help. And with that you close the diary. Some nights end in philosophical musings. Some in passionate letters. And some, like tonight, in quiet culinary protests penned by candlelight and cooled by the memory of perfect raspberry jam. Morning begins with a wardrobe malfunction so subtle it would have escaped notice entirely, if not for your highly developed sense of personal dignity. You stare into the mirror, one eyebrow raised, and slowly come to the horrifying realization. Your hat is green. Not a bold, forest green. Not even a respectable moss. No, this is an uncertain olive, the kind of color that can't decide if it's fashionable or ill. You reach for your diary before even reaching for breakfast. Hat revealed to be green. Utter scandal. Immediate identity crisis. The entry continues in a tone of barely contained distress. Have I always worn a green hat? Has no one spoken up? Is Jenkins color blind? This triggers an emergency review of recent diary pages. Surely you must have described your hat at some point. You flip back furiously. Nothing. Hats mentioned, yes. Adjusted brim, blew off in wind, sat on by cat. But never a color. Devastating oversight. My character may be unsalvageable. You consider confronting Jenkins, but the thought of doing so while still wearing the offending item seems like a tactical error. Instead, you remove the hat, place it on the far end of the room, and glare at it from a safe distance. Victorian diaries are peppered with such entries, tiny style crises blown into operatic proportions. One gentleman recorded an entire week's worth of social discomfort after realizing his pocket square was too symmetrical. Historians still argue whether these fashion-focused ramblings reflect the genuine anxiety of a class obsessed with appearances, or whether they were simply a polite form of self-parody. Either way, the tone is always deeply, delightfully dramatic. You jot another line. Hat has betrayed me. May require burning, or re-dyeing, or forgiveness. You opt for a different hat, a reliable gray bowler that never judges, only purchase politely. But still, the green one lingers in your mind. You can't help but wonder how many conversations, glances, and strolls through the park have been tainted by its unwelcome hue. Reputation likely in tatters. All because of fashion treason atop my head. Midday brings a small distraction. The neighbor's dog, Sir Winslow, has escaped again and is cheerfully terrorizing the azaleas. You note this with a sigh of relief, grateful to redirect your attention. Sir Winslow triumphant. 3 flowerbeds lost. 1 mailman cornered. And yet, even as you watch Jenkins chase the dog with a broom, your thoughts circle back to the hat. Could it be that no one mentioned it out of politeness? Out of fear? Or worse, did they think it suited you? Social silence, worst condemnation of all. You consider wearing it again just to reclaim some agency. But then you remember Lady Fenwick's comment at the theater 2 weeks ago, "How delightfully rustic your ensemble looks tonight." At the time you thought she was admiring your lapel stitching. Now you're not so sure. You sketch the hat in the margin of your diary, labeling it, "Artifact of personal failure." You try to move on. You write about the soup at lunch, acceptable, the postman's new mustache, suspiciously enthusiastic, and a book you almost started reading. But the shadow of the green hat looms large. So you draft a mock letter. Just for the diary. To the hat makers at Penrose and Fielding. I regret to inform you that your taste has ruined me. You don't send it, of course. But the act of writing it provides a kind of theatrical closure. Finally, as evening approaches, you place the hat in a box, cover it with tissue, and tuck it onto the top shelf of the wardrobe. You label the box in pencil, "Do not open in moments of weakness." Your diary entry closes with a simple reflection. Some days define us. Others just dye us the wrong color. You don't mean to make a fuss, but the monocle is gone. Vanished. Evaporated. Dissolved into the air like a thin puff of civility. And naturally, it's just after you've sat down to read a terribly small printed newspaper article about chimney sweeping regulations. You begin today's entry with the gravity the situation deserves. The monocle has fled. Possible treason. Suspect table leg involvement. You pat your coat pocket again, though you've done so 5 times already. You check the folds of your chair, the creases of your waistcoat, even the teacup, as if the monocle might be floating there like an indifferent lemon slice. Nothing. You turn to Jenkins, who raises one eyebrow and says, "Perhaps it's with your green hat, sir?" You consider deducting his wages by 1 farthing for the remark. Instead you write, "Jenkins cheeky today. Maybe emboldened by monocle's absence." Losing a monocle is not a small thing for a Victorian gentleman. It is not merely an accessory, it is a statement of composure, of intellectual readiness, of being one well-placed piece of glass away from scathing social insight. Now you are just squinting. Read newspaper headline as "Queen invents pigeons." Was in fact, questions proposed in Parliament. Disturbing. You fumble your way through the rest of the article, missing key nouns and occasionally inventing new political movements in your mind. Historians still argue whether the monocle was actually practical or purely performative. Some claim it was used to command attention in conversation, raising it just before delivering a dry remark. Others suggest it was largely decorative, a kind of single-lens bluff in the theater of intellect. You don't care what they argue. You just want your monocle back. You enlist Jenkins to search the premises. His commitment is adequate, his enthusiasm lacking. Jenkins's search technique, more of a philosophical inquiry than actual effort. Meanwhile, you try retracing your steps. You'd last had the monocle in the breakfast room, you believe, while judging the marmalade with professional skepticism. You remember raising the lens to inspect a strange orange fleck that turned out to be, well, no one ever truly identified it. You write. Possibly the monocle felt unappreciated. Possibly it's rolling toward France. A thought occurs. What if it fell behind the writing desk? You rise with more energy than usual and peer into the dark, lint-lined void between desk and wall. Not the monocle, but a button. Possibly from your coat. Possibly from 1872. You sit down again. Winded. Mildly defeated. Found artifact instead of monocle. Archaeological mood now engaged. In the distance, a carriage passes. You imagine the monocle catching a ride, bouncing lightly in the pocket of someone far more deserving, perhaps a man with perfect posture and no toast grievances. You glance at the diary and sigh. Vision now half-informed. Squinting through society. But as evening falls, you accept your new state with a kind of begrudging nobility. Perhaps monocles are overrated. Perhaps you've outgrown the need for visual punctuation. Then Jenkins appears, holding a small object wrapped in what appears to be your missing sock. It was beneath the pianoforte, he says, entirely too smug. You rise slowly like a phoenix of decorum and retrieve it. Monocle returned. Journey unknown. Smugness from staff, unmeasured. You hold it up to the light. There it is again, that perfect circle of clarity. You fit it back into place, blinking once with theatrical finality. Vision restored. World once again fractionally more comprehensible. You consider recording this as a victory. But instead, you simply draw a circle in the margin of the page. A monocle. A portal. A lens through which the absurdities of the day are slightly more bearable. And as you turn down the gas lamp and tuck the diary away, you whisper, perhaps only in your mind, "Welcome home, old friend." The candle flickers lower now, casting long shadows across the room in soft, uncertain gestures. The day has exhausted itself and you, half undressed, feet wrapped in house slippers of unknown vintage, return to your diary for the final time tonight. It's not that anything remarkable has occurred. Quite the opposite. But that's exactly why it must be written. Monday concludes. No incidents. No guests. No meaningful conversation. Perfect. You recline in the armchair you've come to trust, the one that conforms to your posture like a loyal but judgmental friend. Beside you, the tea has cooled beyond redemption, but you sip it anyway out of ritual rather than taste. There's a special tone reserved for evening entries, a blend of reflection and resignation with a dash of philosophical muttering. You begin slowly, the pen gliding gently. Final thoughts before sleep. Jenkins forgot the sugar. I forgave him internally. He'll never know. It's the kind of sentence that only matters because you made it matter. You smile faintly though no one is watching. Your eyes drift to the window. The sky is cloudy again, no moon, just a quiet suggestion of darkness. The tulips are somewhere out there plotting. You write. Henrietta remains unreadable. No signs of affection. It feels good to mention her once more. A callback. A character arc. You pause to look back through the day's entries. The hat scandal, the monocle debacle, Thunder's continued reign of psychological terror, the lady in plum, the letter never sent. It's all here, trivial, lovely, absurd. Threads of thought tied neatly into pages. Historians still argue whether these final lines in Victorian diaries were composed with an audience in mind. Were they notes to self or whispered letters to future readers? You suspect both. You add one final note of logistical clarity. No plans for tomorrow. We'll investigate nap opportunities. A practical goal. You reach for the blotting paper, but your thumb smudges the corner before you can use it. You leave it. Imperfection is part of the charm. The room is quiet now. Even Jenkins seems to have stopped lurking. The fire has gone to embers, and your limbs have begun to forget their edges. Still you linger. And so, one more line. Today, like all days, was a whisper. But I wrote it down. You close the diary. Not in a rush. Not with fanfare. Just a soft thwop of leather and memory, like tucking the day into bed. The pen rests beside it, ready for tomorrow. Wind down, 300 words. And now the candle grows shorter. The light fades not just in the room but in your thoughts. Those gentle, swaying thoughts that no longer walk briskly but meander. The diary is closed, the pen is quiet, and even Jenkins has long since vanished into the domestic shadows. The room still holds you. The chair shaped to your frame. The ticking of the clock, too tired now to be precise. The window panes rattle faintly with the last breath of the evening breeze, as though the house itself is exhaling. You sit back, legs stretched, fingers resting on the arm of the chair, and listen, to the stillness, to the hush behind the hush, to the silence that only appears when a day ends gently and asks for nothing more. The stories, so ordinary, settle into you like layers of warm fabric. The misplaced cravat. The jam that redeemed a meal. The green hat scandal and the goose that refused to be soup. All of them tucked now into memory's quiet archive. You feel your breath slowing, matching the softened rhythm of night. The world narrows to this moment, ink dried, pages turned, and the day folded away like a well-worn coat. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the diary sigh in its sleep, content to rest after carrying the weight of such delicate absurdities. So rest now. Let your eyes drift shut. Let the day fade kindly. And if tomorrow brings another dropped monocle, another overly enthusiastic tulip, or toast that threatens your patience, don't worry. You'll write it down. And somehow it will be enough.